Good morning and welcome. We are now in our morning session. This is June the 10th, and let's now go to our Omega files real quickly. We'll want to update our Omega record sheets, and as we are updating those Omega record sheets, we are recording the specific work that is done or was done for June the 7th. Again, just to remind, if you've got makeup work, then you want to be working with Miss Laird to make sure that you have taken care of all of that. I would also recommend that just to keep records for yourself, any time that you are absent and you had to do that makeup work, I recommend that you either circle that date or star that date or number that starred date so that you know you're only allowed 4 of those absences and you don't allow for one of those to get away from you, okay? Alright, let's talk through it real quickly. I've moved our information of the schedule to the board over there. I want to add to your Omega file so there's no confusion the order of your packet. So you may want to write this down. At the end of every session, you will want to have your papers in this order. And I recommend you write that down so that way you can be sure it's very simple. You will then have a stapled packet that you will bring up and just quickly show to Miss Laird as the final approval then to do your thing. The order of that packet will be as follows, and you might want to write this down on your Omega record sheet as order of packets, okay? Number 1, the first thing that you will do in your packet order will always be the reading notes that we took for that day, all right? We'll be in Red Badge of Courage, then we'll be elsewhere, all right? 2, you always want to have your annotation notes. Abbreviate to ANN notes if you'd like. Your annotation notes for today will be the completion of Psalm of Life. Mr. Bolts, question?
Isn't saying annotation notes kind of redundant?
It is to some degree. That's why Mr. Bolts has asked a very important question. That's why I'm making this distinction now with you. Reading is what we always do at the top of the hour, for example, with Red Badge of Courage with Miss Laird. The annotation work particularly is the work that you do with me over a single text, in this case Psalm of Life, and then we'll have every day we'll have some practice annotation work. There's a little bit of a difference, and here's what it is, and I'm glad Mr. Bolts raised it. In that first hour, we're only working predominantly level 1. What does the text say? What does Red Badge of Courage say? We just kind of work through it. When we're working for that half hour of more intensive annotation work, we work through all 3 levels. Make sense? It's a great question. Thank you, Mr. Bolts. The third thing then will always be your typed paper. No jam writing. Several of you handed in your jam writing to me. Just to remind, no jam writing. We always do jam writing, but you do not hand it in to me. One of the easy ways to take care of that is to keep your jam writing in your notebook. And that way it doesn't come out of your notebook. Got me? And then finally, number 4 in the packet order will always be your unstoppable page that you've written. A 1-page response to a chapter from Mr. Conrad's classic Unstoppable. Okay? So with that in mind then, you'll put all that together in that order. You'll staple it, you'll show it to Miss Laird, you'll put it in the Omega file, and then you'll kick it to me through the great bin. Then the next session you return, your Omega file will be sitting inside of the drawer. Notice, no grades on any of this packet information. All you have to do is just complete it, submit it, and I have checked again with Mr. Smith, and July the 3rd is our completion date for this class, as long as everything is done and made up. So for those of you who are light at the end of the tunnel, you can do this real quickly if you want to, and look at your course outline, and you can actually count up the number of days that you are required to be here with me, starting with today's date of the 10th. And you can see we don't actually have that many days now remaining. After this week, we are halfway through our summer session. So for those of you who like the idea of getting out on the 3rd, there is your motivation to make sure that you come to all the sessions. Because if you miss a session, you may have to make that session up in the month of July after the 3rd. Make sense? On the other hand, if you're done, as of the 3rd, we'll be finished. We'll do a final little project, and then we'll call it a summer session for ourselves. All right? Questions, comments? I'd like to make 2 other observations. One, and I'd like you to take a look at this if you're interested. At Learn Strong, especially if you know you're going to be absent. At learnstrong.net, at the bottom of the AM session, there are PDF files there available to you that are in fact annotation notes typed up by Miss Laird. Now, Miss Laird makes those notes while we are actually working together in class. As early now as today, I want us to improve our level 1 notes. And so Miss Laird will actually now have on the overhead, on the whiteboard, the notes that she is taking over Red Badge of Courage. It might be beneficial to you to periodically look up when Miss Laird suggests that we pause to look up and to see the whiteboard. Now, we don't want this to be a distraction to our reading. So don't allow this to become the thing that you're looking at instead of the actual book words of Red Badge of Courage. But when Miss Laird makes the suggestion to pause and write down information, that's when you would want to maybe look up at the whiteboard, see what Miss Laird has been writing down, and see if you can write down something similar. Make sense? It's a good way for you to check yourself to make sure that you're taking good notes. This is a hard skill set to learn, guys. And it's one of the ways you're going to improve your performance next fall in the classroom. Learning how to take good notes while a teacher is talking, while some work is being done. We have to practice at this. And so that's exactly what we are doing. Let's take out now our blank sheet of paper. Starting tomorrow, the expectation is that Miss Laird is ready to go with Red Badge of Courage as early as 8:10. That way we're not wasting a lot of our time. I'm now a little past that. And we will then be ready. Which means what? Well, you need to take out always a blank sheet of paper, always log in, always provide today's date, always say what it is. These are your level 1 reading notes for Red Badge of Courage. Starting on page, so you should have those notes from your previous packet page. Starting on what page? Did anyone write it down? 36. Miss Laird says 36, okay? And so now as we get ready to move on with our work, I have fans running to kind of keep the air moving in our room, which will mean maybe we got to turn the speaker up just a little bit, and you're going to have to really pay close attention so the sound of the fans do not mess with you, all right? Questions, comments? We'll work until 9 o'clock, where we will then turn to our annotation work for 30 minutes. Then we will take our break. Then we will come back for 10 minutes of jam writing. Then we will type our essay. We will finish with our Unstoppable project. Rhythms help us to get through the morning, don't they? That way we know we're fairly consistent. And as we start to get kind of bored, we make ourselves sit up and say, I got to learn how to do this better so that I can get ready for next fall. Yes, that's what you're here for, along obviously with credit recovery. Thank you, Miss Laird. I'm sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. You were asking me a question?
Yeah, how do I turn the over here?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. That is this one right here.
Okay.
And then you look, and I always forget which one it is. It's one of those two. But you see how it turns green?
Right.
And then once that's happening, it's coming on.
Okay.
And then so you can just move that disconnect. Now make it easier for you. All right, it's always beneficial when we get ready to start with Miss Laird you might want to skip back just a few lines or look at your last annotations to remind yourself what happened in the last part of the story. All right? What was going on, etc. All right? Tells us there's no signal here.
Yeah, it may take a minute first.
Okay.
I'll go ahead and
Just get started with the, yeah.
Okay, you guys should start with chapter 5, page 36.
Chapter 5. There were moments of waiting. The youth thought of the village street at home before the arrival of the circus parade on a day in the spring. He remembered how he had stood, a small, thrillful boy, prepared to follow the dingy lady upon the white horse or the band in its faded chariot. He saw the yellow road, the lines of expectant people, and the sober houses. He particularly remembered an old fellow who used to sit upon a cracker box in front of the store and feigned to despise such exhibitions. 1,000 details of color and form surged in his mind. The old fellow upon the cracker box appeared in middle prominence. Someone cried, "Here they come!" There was rustling and muttering among the men. They displayed a feverish desire to have every possible cartridge ready to their hands. The boxes were pulled around into various positions and adjusted with great care. It was as if 700 new bonnets were being tried on. The tall soldier, having prepared his rifle, produced a red handkerchief of some kind. He was engaged in knotting it about his throat with exquisite attention to its position, when the cry was repeated up and down the line in a muffled roar of sound. "Here they come! Here they come!" Gun locks clicked. Across the smoke-infested fields came a brown swarm of running men who were giving shrill yells. They came on, stooping and swinging their rifles at all angles. A flag, tilted forward, sped near the front. As he caught sight of them, the youth was momentarily startled by a thought that perhaps his gun was not loaded. He stood trying to rally his faltering intellect so that he might recollect the moment when he had loaded, but he could not. A hatless general pulled his dripping horse to a stand near the colonel of the 304th. He shook his fist in the other's face. "You've got to hold him back," he shouted savagely. "You've got to hold him back." In his agitation, the colonel began to stammer. "All right, General, all right, by God, we'll do our best, General." The general made a passionate gesture and galloped away. The colonel, perchance to relieve his feelings, began to scold like a wet parrot. The youth, turning swiftly to make sure that the rear was unmolested, saw the commander regarding his men in a highly resentful manner, as if he regretted above everything his association with them. The man at the youth's elbow was mumbling, as if to himself, "Oh, we're in for it now. Oh, we're in for it now." The captain of the company had been pacing excitedly to and fro in the rear. He coaxed in schoolmistress fashion, as to a congregation of boys with primers. His talk was an endless repetition. "Reserve your fire, boys. Don't shoot till I tell you. Save your fire. Wait till they get close up. Don't be damned fools." Perspiration streamed down the youth's face, which was soiled like that of a weeping urchin. He frequently, with a nervous movement, wiped his eyes with his coat sleeve. His mouth was still a little ways open. He got the one glance at the foe swarming field in front of him and instantly ceased to debate the question of his piece being loaded. Before he was ready to begin, before he had announced to himself that he was about to fight, he threw the obedient, well-balanced rifle into position and fired a first wild shot. Directly he was working at his weapon like an automatic affair. He suddenly lost concern for himself and forgot to look at a menacing fate. He became not a man, but a member. He felt that something of which he was a part, a regiment, an army, a cause, or a country, was in crisis. He was welded into a common personality which was dominated by a single desire. For some moments he could not flee no more than a little finger can commit a revolution from a hand. If he had thought the regiment was about to be annihilated, perhaps he could have amputated himself from it. But its noise gave him assurance. The regiment was like a firework that, once ignited, proceeds superior to circumstances until its blazing vitality fades. It wheezed and banged with a mighty power. He pictured the ground before it as strewn with the discomfited. There was a consciousness always of the presence of his comrades about him. He felt the subtle battle brotherhood more potent even than the cause for which they were fighting. It was a mysterious fraternity born of the smoke and danger of death. He was at a task. He was like a carpenter who has made many boxes, making still another box, only there was furious haste in his movements. He, in his thoughts, was careering off in other places, even as the carpenter who, as he works, whistles and thinks of his friend or his enemy, his home or his saloon. And these jolted dreams were never perfect to him afterward, but remained a mass of blurred shapes. Presently he began to feel the effects of the war atmosphere, a blistering sweat, a sensation that his eyeballs were about to crack like hot stones. A burning roar filled his ears. Following this came a red rage. He developed the acute exasperation of a pestered animal, a well-meaning cow worried by dogs. He had a mad feeling against his rifle, which could only be used against one life at a time. He wished to rush forward and strangle with his fingers. He craved a power that would enable him to make a world-sweeping gesture and brush all back. His impotency appeared to him and made his rage into that of a driven beast. Buried in the smoke of many rifles, his anger was directed not so much against the men whom he knew were rushing toward him, as against the swirling battle phantoms which were choking him, stuffing their smoke robes down his parched throat. He fought frantically for respite for his senses, for air, as a babe being smothered attacks the deadly blankets. There was a blare of heated rage mingled with a certain expression of intentness on all faces. Many of the men were making low-toned noises with their mouths, and these subdued cheers, snarls, imprecations, prayers made a wild, barbaric song that went as an undercurrent of sound, strange and chant-like, with the resounding chords of the war march. The man at the youth's elbow was babbling. In it there was something soft and tender like the monologue of a babe. The tall soldier was swearing in a loud voice. From his lips came a black procession of curious oaths. Of a sudden, another broke out and whirled his way like a man who has mislaid his hat. "Well, why don't they support us? Why don't they send support? Do they think—" The youth, in his battle sleep, heard this as one who dozes hears.
This is the end of the CD. The audiobook continues on the next CD.
There was a singular absence of heroic poses. The men, bending and surging in their haste and rage, were in every possible attitude. The steel ramrods clanked and clanged with incessant din as the men pounded them furiously into the hot rifle barrels. The flaps of the cartridge boxes were all unfastened and bobbed idiotically with each movement. The rifles, once loaded, were jerked to the shoulder and fired without apparent aim into the smoke, or at one of the blurred and shifting forms which upon the field before the regiment had been growing larger and larger like puppets under a magician's hand. The officers, at their intervals rearward, neglected to stand in picturesque attitudes. They were bobbing to and fro, roaring directions and encouragements. The dimensions of their howls were extraordinary. They expended their lungs with prodigal wills, and often they nearly stood upon their heads in their anxiety to observe the enemy on the other side of the tumbling smoke. The lieutenant of the youth's company had encountered a soldier who had fled screaming at the first volley of his comrades. Behind the lines, these two were acting a little isolated scene. The man was blubbering and staring with sheep-like eyes at the lieutenant, who had seized him by the collar and was pummeling him. He drove him back into the ranks with many blows. The soldier went mechanically, dully, with his animal-like eyes upon the officer. Perhaps there was to him a divinity expressed in the voice of the other, stern, hard, with no reflection of fear in it. He tried to reload his gun, but his shaking hands prevented. The lieutenant was obliged to assist him. The men dropped here and there like bundles. The captain of the youth's company had been killed in an early part of the action. His body lay stretched out in the position of a tired man resting. But upon his face there was an astonished and sorrowful look, as if he thought some friend had done him an ill turn. The babbling man was grazed by a shot that made the blood stream widely down his face. He clapped both hands to his head. "Oh!" he said, and ran. Another grunted suddenly, as if he had been struck by a club in the stomach. He sat down and gazed ruefully. In his eyes there was mute, indefinite reproach. Farther up the line, a man standing behind a tree had had his knee joint splintered by a ball. Immediately he had dropped his rifle and gripped the tree with both arms. And there he remained, clinging desperately and crying for assistance that he might withdraw his hold upon the tree. At last an exultant yell went along the quivering line. The firing dwindled from an uproar to a last vindictive popping. As the smoke slowly eddied away, the youth saw that the charge had been repulsed. The enemy were scattered into reluctant groups. He saw a man climb to the top of the fence, straddle the rail, and fire a parting shot. The waves had receded, leaving bits of dark debris upon the ground. Some in the regiment began to whoop frenziedly. Many were silent. Apparently they were trying to contemplate themselves. After the fever had left his veins, the youth thought that at last he was going to suffocate. He became aware of the foul atmosphere in which he had been struggling. He was grimy and dripping like a laborer in a foundry. He grasped his canteen and took a long swallow of the warmed water. A sentence with variations went up and down the line. "Well, we've held him back. We've held him back, darned if we haven't." The men said it blissfully, leering at each other with dirty smiles. The youth turned to look behind him and off to the right and off to the left. He experienced the joy of a man who at last finds leisure in which to look about him. Underfoot, there were a few ghastly forms, motionless. They lay twisted in fantastic contortions. Arms were bent and heads were turned in incredible ways. It seemed that the dead men must have fallen from some great height to get into such positions. They looked to be dumped out upon the ground from the sky. From a position in the rear of the grove, a battery was throwing shells over it. The flash of the guns startled the youth at first. He thought they were aimed directly at him. Through the trees he watched the black figures of the gunners as they worked swiftly and intently. Their labor seemed a complicated thing. He wondered how they could remember its formula in the midst of confusion. The guns squatted in a row like savage chiefs. They argued with abrupt violence. It was a grim powwow. Their busy servants ran hither and thither. A small procession of wounded men were going drearily toward the rear. It was a flow of blood from the torn body of the brigade. To the right and to the left were the dark lines of other troops. Far in front, he thought he could see lighter masses protruding in points from the forest. They were suggestive of unnumbered thousands. Once he saw a tiny battery go dashing along the line of the horizon. The tiny riders were beating the tiny horses. From a sloping hill came the sound of cheerings and clashes. Smoke welled slowly through the leaves. Batteries were speaking with thunderous oratorical effort. Here and there were flags, the red and the stripes dominating. They splashed bits of warm color upon the dark lines of troops. The youth felt the old thrill at the sight of the emblems. They were like beautiful birds, strangely undaunted in a storm. As he listened to the din from the hillside, to a deep pulsating thunder that came from afar to the left, and to the lesser clamors which came from many directions, it occurred to him that they were fighting too, over there, and over there, and over there. Heretofore he had supposed that all the battle was directly under his nose. As he gazed around him, the youth felt a flash of astonishment at the blue, pure sky, and the sun gleamings on the trees and fields. It was surprising that nature had gone tranquilly on with her golden process in the midst of so much devilment. Chapter 6.
Okay, go ahead and
The
write
youth
down
awakened.
a few things you observed from chapter 5.
Again, information on the whiteboard can maybe help you. You do not have to write, it down word for word, but it might help you.
Now, if it helps for some of you to turn around so that you guys can see this stuff, you might want to do that at this point before we get going. Okay, we're on page 43. Go ahead and make a new section for chapter 6.
Slowly, he came gradually back to a position from which he could regard himself. For moments, he had been scrutinizing his person in a dazed way, as if he had never before seen himself. Then he picked up his cap from the ground. He wriggled in his jacket to make a more comfortable fit, and kneeling, relaced his shoe. He thoughtfully mopped his reeking features. So it was all over at last. The supreme trial had been passed. The red, formidable difficulties of war had been vanquished. He went into an ecstasy of self-satisfaction. He had the most delightful sensations of his life. Standing as if apart from himself, he viewed that last scene. He perceived that the man who had fought thus was magnificent. He felt that he was a fine fellow. He saw himself even with those ideals which he had considered as far beyond him. He smiled in deep gratification. Upon his fellows he beamed tenderness and goodwill. "Gee, ain't it hot, eh?" he said affably to a man who was polishing his streaming face with his coat sleeves. "You bet," said the other, grinning sociably. "I've never seen such dumb hotness." He sprawled out luxuriously on the ground. "Gee, yes, I hope we don't have no more fighting till a week from Monday." There were some handshakings and deep speeches with men whose features were familiar, but with whom the youth now felt the bonds of tied hearts. He helped a cursing comrade to bind up a wound of the shin. But of a sudden, cries of amazement broke out along the ranks of the new regiment. "Here they come again! Here they come again!" The man who had sprawled upon the ground startled up and said, "Gosh!" The youth turned quick eyes upon the field. He discerned forms begin to swell in masses out of a distant wood. He again saw the tilted flag speeding forward. The shells, which had ceased to trouble the regiment for a time, came swirling again and exploded in the grass or among the leaves of the trees. They looked to be strange war flowers bursting into fierce bloom. The men groaned. The luster faded from their eyes. Their smudged countenances now expressed a profound dejection. They moved their stiffened bodies slowly and watched in sullen mood the frantic approach of the enemy. The slaves toiling in the temple of this god began to feel rebellion at his harsh tasks. They fretted and complained, each to each. "Oh, say, this is too much of a good thing. Why can't somebody send us supports? We ain't never gonna stand this second banging. I didn't come here to fight the whole damn rebel army." There was one who raised a doleful cry. "I wish Bill Smithers had trod on my hand instead of me treading on his." The sore joints of the regiment creaked as it painfully floundered into position to repulse. The youth stared. Surely, he thought, this impossible thing was not about to happen. He waited, as if he expected the enemy to suddenly stop, apologize, and retire, bowing. It was all a mistake. But the firing began somewhere on the regimental line and ripped along in both directions. The level sheets of flame developed great clouds of smoke that tumbled and tossed in the mild wind near the ground for a moment, and then rolled through the ranks as through a gate. The clouds were tinged an earth-like yellow in the sun rays, and in the shadow were a sorry blue. The flag was sometimes eaten and lost in this mass of vapor, but more often it projected, sun-touched, resplendent. Into the youth's eyes there came a look that one could see in the orbs of a jaded horse. His neck was quivering with nervous weakness, and the muscles of his arms felt numb and bloodless. His hands, too, seemed large and awkward, as if he was wearing invisible mittens. And there was a great uncertainty about his knee joints. The words that comrades had uttered previous to the firing began to recur to him. "I'll say, this is too much of a good thing. What do they take us for? Why don't they send supports? I didn't come here to fight the whole damned rebel army." He began to exaggerate the endurance, the skill, and the valor of those who were coming. Himself reeling from exhaustion, he was astonished beyond measure at such persistency. They must be machines of steel. It was very gloomy struggling against such affairs, wound up perhaps to fight until sundown. He slowly lifted his rifle, and catching a glimpse of the thick spread field, he blazed at a cantering cluster. He stopped then and began to peer as best as he could through the smoke. He caught changing views of the ground covered with men who were all running like pursued imps and yelling. To the youth it was an onslaught of redoubtable dragons. He became like the man who lost his legs at the approach of the red and green monster. He waited in a sort of a horrified, listening attitude. He seemed to shut his eyes and wait to be gobbled. A man near him, who up to this time had been working feverishly at his rifle, suddenly stopped and ran with howls. A lad whose face had borne an expression of exalted courage, the majesty of he who dares give his life, was at an instant smitten abject. He blanched like one who has come to the edge of a cliff at midnight and is suddenly made aware. There was a revelation. He, too, threw down his gun and fled. There was no shame in his face. He ran like a rabbit. Others began to scamper away through the smoke. The youth turned his head, shaken from his trance by this movement, as if the regiment was leaving him behind. He saw the few...
Hey, you guys might want to write down what's going on right now. Anybody have any questions?
For sure, make sure for sure that you at least read Ms. Laird's notes on that whiteboard, all right? At least look at them to see them. Just to see how she's taking notes of the reading, okay?
Okay, we are page 46.
The fleeting forms. He yelled then with fright and swung about. For a moment, in the great clamor, he was like a proverbial chicken. He lost the direction of safety. Destruction threatened him from all points. Directly, he began to speed toward the rear in great leaps. His rifle and cap were gone. His unbuttoned coat bulged in the wind. The flap of his cartridge box bobbed wildly, and his canteen, by its slender cord, swung out behind. On his face was all the horror of those things which he imagined. The lieutenant sprang forward, bawling. The youth saw his features wrathfully red, and saw him make a dab with his sword. His one thought of the incident was that the lieutenant was a peculiar creature to feel interested in such matters upon this occasion. He ran like a blind man. 2 or 3 times he fell down. Once he knocked his shoulder so heavily against a tree that he went headlong. Since he had turned his back upon the fight, his fears had been wondrously magnified. Death about to thrust him between the shoulder blades was far more dreadful than death about to smite him between the eyes. When he thought of it later, he conceived the impression that it is better to view the appalling than to be merely within hearing. The noises of the battle were like stones. He believed himself liable to be crushed. As he ran on, he mingled with others. He dimly saw men on his right and on his left, and he heard footsteps behind him. He thought that all the regiment was fleeing, pursued by those ominous crashes. In his flight, the sound of these following footsteps gave him his one meager relief. He felt vaguely that death must make a first choice of the men who were nearest. The initial morsels for the dragons would be then those who were following him. So he displayed the zeal of an insane sprinter in his purpose to keep them in the rear. There was a race. As he, leading, went across a little field, he found himself in a region of shells. They hurtled over his head with long, wild screams. As he listened, he imagined them to have rows of cruel teeth that grinned at him. Once, one lit before him, and the livid lightning of the explosion effectually barred the way in his chosen direction. He groveled on the ground, and then, springing up, went careering off through some bushes. He experienced a thrill of amazement when he came within view of a battery in action. The men there seemed to be in conventional moods, altogether unaware of the impending annihilation. The battery was disputing with a distant antagonist, and the gunners were wrapped in admiration of their shooting. They were continually bending in coaxing postures over the guns. They seemed to be patting them on the back and encouraging them with words. The guns, stolid and undaunted, spoke with dogged valor. The precise gunners were coolly enthusiastic. They lifted their eyes every chance to the smoke-wreathed hillock from whence the hostile battery addressed them. The youth pitied them as he ran. Methodical idiots, machine-like fools. The refined joy of planting shells in the midst of the other battery's formation would appear a little thing when the infantry came swooping out of the woods. The face of a youthful rider who was jerking his frantic horse with an abandon of temper he might display in a placid barnyard was impressed deeply upon his mind. He knew that he looked upon a man who would presently be dead. Too, he felt a pity for the guns, standing, 6 good comrades in a bold row. He saw a brigade going to the relief of its pestered fellows. He scrambled upon a wee hill and watched it sweeping finely, keeping formation in difficult places. The blue of the line was crusted with steel color, and the brilliant flags projected. Officers were shouting. This sight also filled him with wonder. The brigade was hurrying briskly to be gulped into the infernal mouths of the war god. What manner of men were they anyhow? It was some wondrous breed, or else they didn't comprehend, the fools. A furious order caused commotion in the artillery. An officer on a bounding horse made maniacal motions with his arms. The teams went swinging up from the rear. The guns were whirled about, and the battery scampered away. The cannon, with their noses poked slantingly at the ground, grunted and grumbled like stout men, brave but with objections to hurry. The youth went on, moderating his pace, since he had left the place of noises. Later he came upon a general of division seated upon a horse that pricked its ears in an interested way at the battle. There was a great gleaming of yellow and patent leather about the saddle and bridle. The quiet man astride looked mouse-colored upon such a splendid charger. A jingling staff was galloping hither and thither. Sometimes the general was surrounded by horsemen, and at other times he was quite alone. He looked to be much harassed. He had the appearance of a businessman whose market is swinging up and down. The youth went slinking around this spot. He went as near as he dared, trying to overhear words. Perhaps the general, unable to comprehend chaos, might call upon him for information. And he could tell him. He knew all concerning it. Of a surety, the force was in a fix, and any fool could see that if they did not retreat while they had opportunity, why... He felt that he He would like to thrash the general, or at least approach and tell him in plain words exactly what he thought him to be. It was criminal to stay calm in one spot and make no effort to stay destruction. He loitered in a fever of eagerness for the division commander to apply to him. As he warily moved about, he heard the general call out irritably, "Tompkins, go over and see Taylor and tell him not to be in such an all-fired hurry. Tell him to halt his brigade in the edge of the woods. Tell him to detach a regiment. Say, I think the center will break if we don't help it out some. Tell him to hurry up." A slim youth on a fine chestnut horse caught these swift words from the mouth of his superior. He made his horse bound into a gallop almost from a walk in his haste to go upon his mission. There was a cloud of dust. A moment later, the youth saw the general bounce excitedly in his saddle. "Yes, by heavens, they have!" The officer leaned forward. His face was aflame with excitement. "Yes, by heavens, they've held him! They've held him!" He began to blithely roar at his staff. "We'll wallop him now! We'll wallop him now! We've got him sure!" He turned suddenly upon an aide. "Here, you, Jones, quick, right after Tompkins. See Taylor. Tell him to go in everlastingly like blazes, anything." As another officer sped his horse after the first messenger, the general beamed upon the earth like a sun. In his eyes was a desire to chant a paean. He kept repeating, "They've held him, by heavens." His excitement made his horse plunge, and he merrily kicked and swore at it. He held a little carnival of joy on horseback.
Hey. The most significant thing that happened in this chapter was that he was slinking around, observing what was going on in the battle, trying not to get noticed. Okay, we're at the bottom of page 50, chapter 7.
Chapter 7. The youth cringed as if discovered in a crime. By heavens, they had won after all. The imbecile line had remained and become victors. He could hear cheering. He lifted himself upon his toes and looked in the direction of the fight. A yellow fog lay wallowing on the treetops. From beneath it came the clatter of musketry. Hoarse cries told of an advance. He turned away, amazed and angry. He felt that he had been wronged. He had fled, he told himself, because annihilation approached. He had done a good part in saving himself, who was a little piece of the army. He had considered the time, he said, to be one in which it was the duty of every little piece to rescue itself, if possible. Later, the officers could fit the little pieces together again and make a battlefront. If none of the little pieces were wise enough to save themselves from the flurry of death at such a time, why, then where would be the army? It was all plain that he had proceeded according to very correct and commendable rules. His actions had been sagacious things. They had been full of strategy. They were the work of a master's legs. Thoughts of his comrades came to him. The brittle blue line had withstood the blows and won. He grew bitter over it. It seemed that the blind ignorance and stupidity of those little pieces had betrayed him. He had been overturned and crushed by their lack of sense in holding the position, when intelligent deliberation would have convinced them that it was impossible. He, the enlightened man, who looks afar in the dark, had fled because of his superior perceptions and knowledge. He felt a great anger against his comrades. He knew it could be proved that they had been fools. He wondered what they would remark when later he appeared in camp. His mind heard howls of derision. Their density would not enable them to understand his sharper point of view. He began to pity himself acutely. He was ill-used. He was trodden beneath the feet of an iron injustice. He had proceeded with wisdom and from the most righteous motives under heaven's blue, only to be frustrated by hateful circumstances. A dull, animal-like rebellion against his fellows, war in the abstract, and fate grew within him. He shambled along with bowed head, his brain in a tumult of agony and despair. When he looked loweringly up, quivering at each sound, his eyes had the expression of those of a criminal who thinks his guilt little and his punishment great, and knows that he can find no words. He went from the fields into a thick woods, as if resolved to bury himself. He wished to get out of hearing of the crackling shots which were to him like voices. The ground was cluttered with vines and bushes, and the trees grew close and spread out like bouquets. He was obliged to force his way with much noise. The creepers, catching against his legs, cried out harshly as their sprays were torn from the barks of trees. The swishing saplings tried to make known his presence to the world. He could not conciliate the forest. As he made his way, it was always calling out protestations. When he separated embraces of trees and vines, the disturbed foliages waved their arms and turned their face leaves toward him. He dreaded lest these noisy motions and cries should bring men to look at him. So he went far, seeking dark and intricate places. After a time, the sound of musketry grew faint, and the cannon boomed in the distance. The sun, suddenly apparent, blazed among the trees. The insects were making rhythmical noises. They seemed to be grinding their teeth in unison. A woodpecker stuck his impudent head around the side of a tree. A bird flew on light-hearted wing. Off was the rumble of death. It seemed now that nature had no ears. This landscape gave him assurance. A fair field holding life. It was the religion of peace. It would die if its timid eyes were compelled to see blood.